Okay. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Hannah Borden and I am co-chairing the Transmedia Arts Seminar with today's speaker, MAGDA ROMANSKA. Thank you for gathering with us here today. So before I introduce MAGDA and say a few words about our collaboration, I want to express our sincere thank you for the support of the seminar's two co-sponsors, the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Meta Lab, both at Harvard University. Also, I want to make some pragmatic announcements. After Magda's talk, there will be time for a discussion. So during the session, you are welcome to submit your questions and provocations via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you would prefer to interact via voice and image, we do have that capacity as well. This seminar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the Mahindra Humanities Center website, provided with closed captions and available for public viewing. So please let me to assure you that by joining the webinar, you have no obligation to appear or to speak in the recording. So if you would like to participate in an anonymous way, you can do so under an alias and by turning off the video. If you would like to participate in an identifiable way, we want to be sure to say that by doing so, you are authorizing the use of the recording in the way I just described it. So this is the first fall semester meeting of the Transmedia Arts Seminar, which is now in its second year. So the seminar is positioned to explore theatrical practices and performances by triangulating new media technologies, transmediality, and performativity. Conceived to inquire into the emerging forms of transmedia performance, it explores medial interactions in the physical space of theater, as well as multi-platform, networked and interactive medial environments that expand the theatrical space as they extend beyond it. Aside for critical transmedia exploration, the seminar is also a space through which we began to think about and design what we call the Transmedia Arts Center, an online public platform dedicated to archival documentation, curating, and disseminating transmedia performance. So we are very excited about the talks scheduled for this academic year, and you will find more, or you can find all of them on the Mahindra Humanities Center webpage under the Transmedia Arts Seminar. But to give you an idea about the next upcoming events, on October 23rd, at the same time, at 5 p.m. EDT, Francesca Ferrando, one of the leading posthuman philosophers, will talk about transmedia and the art of posthuman existence. And on November 19, Joris Weidom, who teaches at the University of the Arts Utrecht, where he also founded the Media and Performance Laboratory, will talk about embodiment and presence in designing performative mixed reality experiences. So these and more events to come will be prefaced today by MAGDA ROMANSKA's paper, Transmedia Dramaturgy of Pre- and Post-Pandemic Theatre, a talk that addresses an urgent disciplinary question: how are we, the practitioners and scholars of theatre, to analyze, problematize, and develop narratives relying on multiple structural and architectural frameworks when our pre-pandemic points of reference and certainties have all changed? I think that Magda hardly needs an introduction. She is a prolific theatre performance and media scholar, dramaturg, and writer. MAGDA ROMANSKA is an associate professor of theatre and dramaturgy at Emerson College, an affiliate at MetaLab here at Harvard, and the executive director of the largest global digital theater portal, thetheatertimes.com, for which she won the Elliot Hayes Award for Outstanding Achievement in Dramaturgy in 2018. Another significant digital project she conceptualized and developed is performap.org, an interactive digital map of theater festivals funded through Yale Digital Humanities Lab and the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas Innovation Grant. She's the author or editor of 5 critically acclaimed theater books: The Post-Traumatic Theater of Grotowski and Cantor, Theater Machine, Tadeusz Kantor in Context, Breeder in Comedy, an anthology of theory and criticism, and the Routledge Companion to Dramaturgy. Currently, she is also the editor of the series Focus on Dramaturgy, published by Routledge. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Professor MAGDA ROMANSKA.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for this introduction. Welcome everyone to our Transmedia Arts Seminar. We are very happy and grateful that you can join us. And as Hannah mentioned, special thanks to Mahindra Humanities Center and MetaLab for sponsoring this event and our series this year. Today's lecture is going to be a kind of an introduction, an overview to the different types of transmedia experiments that have been taking place on the margins of theater pre-pandemic. And some questions that I pose are attempts to trying to create a critical vocabulary in the way that we think and talk about those works. And I will also look at some of the newest developments that happened since the pandemic started, and much of theater moved into the online space, creating again new possibilities for a new media. So this talk is designed to be accessible for both non-theater and theater people. So I hope everyone can get something out of it. First, let's start with our working definition of what transmedia is. And here is the 2 definitions, one from Henry Jenkins and the second one from Robert Platten, who basically define transmedia as a multi-platform storytelling in which a story is enhanced through being told through multiple media. It is not adaptation. Every component of the story can exist on its own. And audience participation oftentimes heightens the enjoyment of the story and the engagement. This is classic in before transmedia, and we conceptualize each discipline separately, and each discipline, each genre had its own mechanics and its own rules. Where we are right now is this world when things blend into each other, and we end up with video game opera and interactive fiction writing. As these different media blend into each other and influence each other, we learning that they also are creating a new way of thinking about how stories, how narratives are being structured in 3-dimensional space of real world and digital world. So these are the most pertinent dramaturgical questions. What are the laws and rules of transmedia storytelling? What storytelling structure from film, drama, novel should we use? How are audiences going to interact with these new stories? What is essential and what is superfluous? And of course, the big question, what is the point? There are basically two models of transmedia. What I call the autonomous and codependent. In autonomous model, each component of the storytelling can exist independently. So something like a franchise like Star Wars is always quoted in this, since each element of the Star Wars franchise can exist as an independent story. Then there is the codependent, where all elements of the story are connected in such a way that it would be impossible to understand the meaning of the story unless you know all of its components. So Norwegian TV show Skam, which has a very big online component, is one example where you sort of have to know what's going on between the characters online to understand the TV series. Then there is the model which combines both of these elements. Each component can exist independently, but when you approach them together, the enjoyment of the entire work increases, and the meaning also becomes richer. And this is what happens in most of the theater-based transmedia experiences. Now, transmedia itself is a rather big umbrella. And I want to just give you a short overview of what, when we talk about transmedia, what we can potentially mean. So of course, there is the transmedia for the purposes of marketing, which are built strictly around commercial objective. There are, of course, franchises such as Star Wars. With franchises, typically there is a very clear point of origin. So there is one piece of work which is popular, and then things grow out of it. It has a vertical structure, and it's usually open-ended, which allows for additional components to be added. Then there is an event, which is typically contained by the time frame. It's horizontal in structure. It has a clear ending, and however, oftentimes it has no unclear point of origin, since many things happen simultaneously. Then there is the educational purpose, where multiple platforms are used to advance an educational purpose. And then, of course, there is the social and political purpose, where transmedia is used to advance either political or social cause. And this is, as Hannah's lecture last year showed, it's actually been around for quite some time and used in different political systems quite effectively to advance a particular political point. And then there's, of course, the artistic, which doesn't have any particular purpose beyond exploration of the medium, potentially some sort of philosophical message. Those type of projects are interconnected, and they typically are pre-designed. So unlike franchise, which oftentimes sort of builds on the success of the previous work, artistic projects, which most of the theater projects are pre-designed and focus on more idealistic purpose than others. The dramaturgical variables. So today, in today's lecture, I'm going to focus on the artistic types of transmedia, which usually involve some form of theatrical foundation, whether live or digital. And as we are discussing this type of transmedia performances, the two important aspects we want to look at are the external and internal variables. So the external variables is time, space, and action. And here I'm being very classical in my approach, and I'm referring to, of course, Aristotle, and internal plot, character, and thought. So I would like to use this sort of basic familiar terminology to show different examples of transmedia and how they can be analyzed depending on which variable is altered. So let me see. This is let me just, sorry. As we're progressing through classical Aristotelian dramaturgy to transmedia dramaturgy, we see a certain shift in the way that time, space, and action is being dislocated. So, of course, Aristotelian dramaturgy, the well-made play, demands that all are in unison. So we have unity of time, space, and action. In epic, Brechtian and post-dramatic dramaturgy allows us for dissonance of all three on stage. However, for the audience, the story still takes place, whatever is happening on stage, it still takes place on stage. So the audience is literally in the same place and time at the same time, in the same place, in the same building. But in transmedia dramaturgy, you not only dislocate the internal variable of time, space, and action, things can take place in multiple spaces, in multiple time frames. You also dislocate for the audience themselves, because now audience can approach it from multiple vantage points, and their location, their geographic location, their time location, doesn't have a particular meaning as it did previously. So the transmedia dramaturgy challenges the notion of spectatorial co-presence. So the co-presence can be developed along the time-space continuum. In theater, we all watch the same thing at the same time in the same space. In the museum, we all watch the same thing at different times. In multi-site, multilinear transmedia stories, co-presence can be manipulated to both create the communal experience of theater when things happen in sync, and the individual solitary experience of the novel, for example. The spectator can watch the same thing at the same time in the same space, but they no longer necessarily have to. The questions that we ask, of course, is time, when, where, and how. And I want to show you a couple of different examples of transmedia that happened before the pandemic that dislocate one of each variable. And so the first example that I want to use is a J-shaped World of Wires, which is a theater performance, which is also being recorded live and projected on the screen. Depending on which, whether the audience member watches the stage performance or the video performance, they get a different experience of the work. So let me play it for you.
I was staring at the stack traces all night long. I think I fixed the problem in the latency.
You were up all night?
Yeah, can you plug me in?
So we're watching a video recording.
Oh, dude, I think I figured out how to model barometric pressure. So if you notice anything like air popping or something, you let me know, okay?
Yes.
3, 2, 1. Thank God it works.
So this is a really great example that shows us how manipulating two different platforms can create a quite different experience for the audience members who watch what's going on stage, because of course they will see the transformation, and those who watch the screen, because of course, you know, for them it's a magic, yeah. And so this is a performance in which time, space, and action is in sync, but nonetheless, there are different subjective experience depending on which platform the audiences chooses to participate. Now, this is another example of a video game opera. When I work on this one as a consultant, a transmedia consultant, and it had a kind of a 3-layer of interaction. The audience, the performers would be singing and performing here, and here would be their avatars being screened and also performing on the screen, on the top screen. So I'm gonna play this just a little bit for you. The way that this worked was that there was a faceware singer who would basically repeat what the opera singers were singing, and then this, would be projected on the screen. So we had 3 levels of video: the live feed, the camera feed, and the faceware bodyware feed. So this is a pretty common synced performance with multi-platform framing. And this is kind of how it looked like. This is an opera singer, this is the faceware singer, and this is the CGI character that mimics what the singer does on stage. The technology here was challenging, and of course, the question is, for what purposes does it serve? And an additional component, there was also an app which allow participants to view different characters as well. Here is a really fun opera that I saw in New York last year, in which the audience, I don't have a video of this one because it's not posted yet, but I can tell you it's the audience members at the beginning were asked to provide their email addresses, and the performance, the show itself was about surveillance. And as at some point during the performance, the live feed from participants' social media was projected on the walls, which had a somewhat disorienting disorienting experience. Was a disorienting experience for us because suddenly you saw your social media feed projected live among participants, which was kind of strange because it is a public sphere. However, having this projected in person seemed to estrange the experience. So adding this social media platform component was both a kind of a new way of using a form of social media, but also commenting on the content of the narrative, which had to do with surveillance. The next example, so those were all examples of all of the dimensions being in sync. Now I want to show you a couple of things that had a multi-platform, multi-site structure. So this one, Everyone at Once, was a performance which took place in 3 different places around the world. Each performance had their own audience, and then they were all projected and screened together on YouTube. So the challenge with doing something like this is that each component has to be independently viable for the audience members who watched it live, and then everything has to be coordinated in order to make sense for the people who watch it simultaneously online as well. So this is quite challenging to do, and simply because syncing all of those things can be difficult. This was one of the earliest multi-site performances that used digital format. Andre Carrera Odyssey, which took place in 3 different places: Buenos Aires, Bremen, Germany, and Florianopolis, Brazil. And it was a story of a man caught between a wife and a mistress. And in each location, the audience members could see the person's conversation with the other party. So you had kind of an input into seeing what each character saw on location, and then you also had an input into seeing what they experience by talking to other people. When Andre was talking about this performance, he was acutely aware how it sort of dissolves time and space, and this is what he says: both the actors and the spectators, there is a change in relation to the perception of time and space. The dissolution of space and time creates a condition marked by placelessness and achrony, absence of time. An increasingly more common experience today, which our cultural habitats naturalize. We live in an era in which we no longer marvel at the fact that we can talk to someone on the other side of the planet, sharing images and data simultaneously, or at our capacity to build a world of information through websites and blogs. And the very idea of theatricality is supported by a concept of an expanded scene in which the notion of unity of place dissolves to emphasize the unity of time. So this is, one of those early multi-site performances that nonetheless was very effective and utilized, the format to comment on the content. And now, this was, big craze in the early 2010s for all types of telematic performances. And here is one which was the augmented reality dance using, let me just show you. Using an app to coordinate and sync performances. Let me just 40 seconds. So this type of synchronized telematic performances have a kind of an format of an event. They happened within a particular time frame, and they have a beginning and end, and they typically are not narrative bound. So they are just coordinated forms of flash mobs. I haven't seen yet a good way to utilize them in the performance which would have a narrative structure, but nonetheless this was one of the early options out there, and hopefully we might put them forth more. One of the earliest cyber dramas was the e-theaters Chalk Circle. This was a chat-based theater piece in which time was out of joint because you could come in and out whenever you wanted. It was sort of ongoing project, and it was one of the very early uses of digital space for the for theater theatrical purposes. And the other one, which was also sort of with time being out of joint, was Open Online Theater, a project in which the audience members can log in and participate by directing dancers and interacting with the dancers as they were performing. Of course, there is a whole genre that also developed about 10 years ago of different kinds of social media plays, both Twitter and Facebook, either through multiple accounts or told through one account. And so we see how these early experiments are attempting to dislocate the question of time and the question of space. The more recent examples, something like Hopscotch, which was immersive opera out of Los Angeles, which consisted of 36 chapters performed across the city on location and within taxi cabs. At the end, everybody came together and there was a kind of a synced final scene. And here is a little video that I can play for you, how it was.
To create this experience was a pretty massive logistical undertaking. We had 24 live chapters that the audience would experience while traveling around 3 distinct routes. We labeled these routes red, yellow, and green, and each route weaved through different geographical neighborhoods around downtown Los Angeles. Each route contained 8 chapters. Each chapter lasted around 10 minutes, either taking place in moving limousines or at iconic Los Angeles sites. Each gave a glimpse into different parts of the city and different moments into these characters' lives.
We wanted to create a story that was open enough that any single chapter could feel like its own point of departure. The principal character is Lucha, a woman. We see her throughout the various stages of her life. There's Jameson, a scientist who rides a motorcycle, very angsty, and Orlando, who is a musician and poet and philosopher. And the 3 of these characters, the principal story really is watching them navigate a world of change, a world that is constantly in flux.
We follow Lucha from when she's young to when she is old, and basically somewhere in the middle of this
piece, the old Lucia communicates with the young Lucia. So we see her have a quinceañera, we see her fall in love, we see her get married, we see that fall apart. We see her try to make peace with that and really struggle. We see her meet someone else and then make peace with being able to feel something again. And we see it in this really wild variety of sounds and this wild variety of different art forms. And the hope is that you can kind of tap in at any moment and tap out at any moment and still get a feeling of a life.
So for theater scholars, of course, this will remind you the medieval mystery plays performed all around the town with different scenes performed at different locations. So this is, one of those good examples where we have multi-story narrative happening on multiple levels and in different time and space, and you can also, see them on screen as well. Here is another fun example from a Shakespeare Company adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dreaming, which included a big component of crowdsourcing, when the audience members would contribute to the background stories of all of the characters through different social media.
Thou lovest me then. Steal forth thy father's house tomorrow night, and in the wood, a league without the town, there shall I stay for thee.
I will go tell him of fair Hermia's flight. Then to the wood he will tomorrow night pursue her.
I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows.
So Shakespeare Company was, had already pre-existing audience, and they were able to build on that audience to create this entire online second life for these characters and locate them in the present through social media interaction. So this happened quite a lot when the work is given out to the audience members, and they are the ones who create various transmedia components, taking the story outside of the prime location into different areas. Here is another good example. This was an adaptation of Tempest by Ritz Theater Company, and this was an interesting one. I'm gonna turn off the volume on this because it's just.
Thou dost give me pains.
This was a quite interesting one, which they built for over 6 months. By interacting with the audience members online and on the phone and through other media, and once a while creating this site-based performances where the audience members could follow the characters in real life, and then on top of it, the audience members eventually began building stories and interacting and collaborating with the performers. So this was quite an interesting example of the sort of performance, which was stretched in time and really played with the duration. This was a discussion of our external variables of time, space, and action. And here I want to talk about the variables internal to the story. So plot, theme, and the characters. So the plot oftentimes is nonlinear and almost always multi-directional. A theme, is there one? You are the character and the character is you, oftentimes with the audience participation. And of course, there is a whole group of transmedia characters, which are techno-objects, which I will mention each one of them. So this is just, refresher course, classical dramaturgy, classical plot line for the a typical well-made play, theater play. Yeah, we have the inciting incident, raising action, climax, falling action, resolution, and scene of suffering somewhere around here. This has been mostly adapted by film, filmmakers, and people play with it, but the order of things can change. You can try to avoid catharsis or sorts of, those sorts of things. You can have multiple climaxes, or you can have, scene of suffering before climax and things like that. But that's the sort of, the basic structure of drama, of traditional realistic drama. Now, in the new transmedia world, however, this does not really work. We no longer talk about plot. Instead, we talk about narrative architecture or dramatic architectonics, because here you tell a story, you tell the sequence of events. First of all, is out of order and oftentimes spread around across multiple platforms. Plus, audience often interacts with the architecture of the space that you're building, either in real life or online. And the story or the information is given to the audience members through the architecture of the space in which they explore. The story no longer has to be told through characters. It can be told through the space or through objects that the audience interacts with. And of course, from the video game, we get a bunch of new models of plot. We have we have a branching structure in which the multiple endings for each audience member, depending on which path and they take, what is their point of access. They can end up in different at different endings. Then there we have let me just scroll here. We have the interactive plot structure in which the audience members start together, and then each one goes into different directions. Even though they might have different endings, they might interact at some point as the plot progresses. Here is one of my favorite models, the exploding model, when something happens over here and then everybody goes into different direction and everyone gets a different experience. This is, of course, typically used for the events-based transmedia, and it's quite difficult to manage because you don't know what you might end up with in terms of what the audience experience potentially can be. And here, a couple of different examples of traditional game design models, web, maze, tree, and vector. And all of these, have been used successfully in different types of immersive performances. And, depends on how do you want to lead your audience, whether you want to have multiple endings, multiple access points, and how much control do you want to give your audience in the interaction. So in classical dramaturgy, the dramatic structure, we ask about character's motivation, about climactic moment, and about catharsis. In transmedia storytelling, we ask about the agency of the audience and the level of connectivity between different components of the story and the audience point of access. So the agency of the audience, how much they're gonna contribute, how different components of the story are connected or not, and where will the audience access the work, through which point, through a live performance or through social media, where there'll be a point of access or where there'll be multiple points of access. And all of these decisions have to be made in order for you to understand, how your story will be received, how your narrative will be received. So here is, what's new in plot. So classical dramaturgy, we have, oh, sorry. I just accidentally clicked the wrong button. In the classical dramaturgy, we have exposition, characters' motivations, climactic moment, scene of suffering, reversal, recognition, catharsis, and we have the journey from the beginning to the end. And in drama school, they always teach you to look at the first scene, look at the last scene, and see how we got from the first scene to the last scene. Yeah, it's a controlled, closed work. Which the theme, the thought of the work happens in between the beginning and the end. But in transmedia dramaturgy, the questions we ask are a little bit different. First, which variable will be fixed? Time, space, and action. Agency of the audience. So how much choice and how much control the audience have. Exploration of the environment, free play. How much audience can just sort of explore without any intrusion. The level of connectivity between audience members and between different storytelling modules. So autonomous versus codependent model. the audience point of access, where is the beginning and where is the end, since we can have multiple beginnings and multiple endings. And of course, how much control do you want to have over how this beginning and this ending is being processed. In terms of the character, the difference is, between the Aristotelian character is proper, believable, consistent, and this is, basic description of the realist drama. In the post-dramatic theater, the character is a figuration, symbol, metaphor, object, prop, abstract, and this, theater of the absurd, post-dramatic theater in which we experience death of a Aristotelian character. In transmedia dramaturgy, the character is often you, and you are the character. So this all sorts of participatory, experiential, immersive, interactive experiences, location-based, hybrid reality performance games. And the second types of characters, which are sort of new, not completely new, are techno-objects, versus Tadeusz Kantor's bio-objects, and techno-objects include algorithmic theater, robots, AI, data theater, and all sorts of different post-human characters that also interact with audience in different ways. This is just, sort of the refresher course, but also help us see those differences. This is, realistic painting, the real characters, easy to identify. The painting has 3-act structure. We know what happened before, and we know what happens after, We know before, most likely, this is a night, there is a houses over here, he's wearing pajamas, most likely, the soldiers came, dragged him out of bed, and, this is the climactic moment when we see the execution, and we know what's going to happen tomorrow morning. The wife, the mother will come and will find the bodies there. This painting is a sort of, realistic drama as painted. And the unity of time, space, and action, everything is defined, and there's the defined and consistent thought. The painter clearly wants to make a statement about the miseries of war. Now, here is, in the post-dramatic theater, Picasso, Guernica also representing war, but things are a little bit more complicated. There is, we cannot really easily identify with any single character because characters are symbolic, metaphorical, and allegorical. There is undefined time and space, like is it 1 minute or 1 year? Unclear action, everything happens at the same time. And we have multiple and subjective thoughts about it. There is not one unifying thought that tells us how to think about war. Now in transmedia, thanks to the newsfeed, this is what we get. We get multiple characters, multiple structure, this unity of time, space, and action, and incoherent thought, intermingled and contradictory images, oftentimes flattened by the media. So when you go on your news feed, Facebook or Twitter, on Instagram, you get tons of different images coming at you without any sort of coherent story. And so how do you build that story, and how that story is being built by you? These are the sort of, questions that we are trying to explore, because it's, it's this creation of the meaning in that space has quite a lot of implications, not just for ad making, but for political messaging as well. So this is sort of, where we go from. We go from this realistic 3-act structure to this unity of time and space, to something that we don't really grasp yet in terms of what does it do to our psychic and how we process that. What's new in character? So in classical dramaturgy, is focused on the character building. Stanislavski's method of, how do you build a character? People are doing things usually to other people. In a transmedia world, we are also concerned with the world building. So oftentimes you are doing things, people are doing things, objects, algorithms are doing things. You don't always know who is doing what, how, and to whom. There's a sort of additional level of analysis and thinking, because the agency is not always easy to locate. We don't always know, who is the agent beyond what's going on there between interaction of these different components. So challenges is for the arts makers, for the theater makers, is the vertical and horizontal integration of the world rules. So whenever you're building this world, it has to be consistent across multiple platforms. It has to have morally justified symbolic structure, and it has to answer the question like, so what? Like, why do you building this? Why do you making this? When the character is you, when this is an immersive piece, the questions we're asking is the question of agency, choice. So what are the perceived consequences of the audience action? Interiority, the limits of interiority, and the inner complexity of the character. So how much of the personal information, intimate detail, are you asking your audience members to reveal about themselves in order to participate in the project? Then exploration, the free exploration of the environment. Challenge, how difficult and engaging the experience. If the entry point is too difficult, people will give up. If it's too easy or not engaging, they will also give up. Complicity, how much the audience participation increases responsibility for the work which the audience creates. And then of course, co-creation, how much do you allow audience to contribute to the works which they are making. When the character is techno-objects, different types, robots, algorithms, artificial intelligence, holograms, brain arts, VR, AR. There are different ways of thinking about them, and this is the total 3-act structure of the human-machine collaboration: the pre-processing, in which the machine is programmed, configured, and loaded by the human; co-processing, in which the machine and the human produce text in tandem; and post-processing, in which the human selects some of the machine's effusions and excludes others. This, a techno-object as a character is not totally new in theater, because we already had bio-objects, we had puppets, we had all sorts of different objects always explored on stage and in different contexts. What's new here, that oftentimes this object seem to exist independently, have their own agency, particularly when you're dealing with algorithm and when you're dealing with pre-programmed machines. So here is one example of robot theater. I don't know why the voice. So this was a Franz Kafka's adaptation with the robot, in the main role, and how does the audience members interact, and how can the robot function on its own is question to explore. The other examples, this was one of my favorite projects, the Google Homes talking to each other. So what do you do when you have 2 chatbots interacting? And it evoked a lot of laughter. I'm not gonna play you the whole thing, but I recommend you check it out. The famous Annie Dorson's famous Hello, Hi There, which was a debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault, sort of put into algorithm.
I don't have a question.
Do you have a question?
That's a question I don't hear every day.
A question you don't hear every day is a terrible thing to waste.
Are all questions you don't hear every day a terrible thing to waste? We're here to discuss Chomsky and Foucault.
Oh sure, Chomsky and Foucault sounds like a good topic.
The title of the debate is Human Nature, Justice versus Power.
Chomsky and Foucault discuss the nature of power, among other things.
Essentially, it's humanism versus post-humanism.
Thank you for the clarification, my dear friend.
What Chomsky says in the first minute and half could have been said in a quarter of the words he used.
Thank you for the explanation.
It sucks that you can't have real conversations like this in America. You always run into undereducated, emotional hicks.
It is a sad day for sure. This sort of debate is virtually non-existent today, especially in America.
Glasses were so much cooler back then.
Okay.
Do you have any idea what I'm talking about?
I'd like to talk to someone else now. Guys, who's gonna surprise me with a hot private message? My ex got me into it, now I'm hooked. 21F, by the way.
So, you know, when you're using an algorithm, like what does the algorithm do? Does it have its own agency, and how it can coexist and co-create with the performers? This was another piece which used sex dolls, supercomputer, and pet robot and digital monk, all kind of interacting on stage. And of course, you can program those things for the audience to interact in any way you want. And you can also use algorithm online to divide audiences or to structure their experiences. Here is quite an interesting dance piece, which had a robotic component fused with the actor, and it was based on the neurorobotics research in Berlin of sort of using the extension as a part of the artistic project. This was one in which used holograms and I don't know. Okay, the next one is Brainard. This was Ellen Perelman's brain opera, in which her brain was hooked up to the electrodes, and depending on her emotions, different colors were projected on the screen, and her emotions were dependent on the story that she was telling, and so the audience members could see how her brain functioned in real time through this mechanism. So this sort of combinations of different types of brain arts can happen both in the live performance, but also through social media as well, and through through computer. This was a project which was a VR adaptation of Hamlet. It's a kind of like hold on, let me show you something. So, yeah.
Oh, I will. The hour has almost come when I, to softness and tormenting flames, must render up myself. Oh, alas, poor ghost! Pity me not, but lend thy serious hearing to things I shall unfold. Oh, speak, I am bound to...
This type of adaptations, sort of beg the question, like, why do we need a VR version of Hamlet if we can have a real life version of Hamlet? They don't always necessarily utilize the full medium of the technology which they're using, but they nonetheless, interesting to look at. Here is a company from Poland, Dream Adoption Society, which is trying to use VR in performance in a way that's comments on the medium itself. So this project, Białoszewski-Ginsberg, was trying to create the experience of reading the poetry of Białoszewski and Ginsberg. And their second project was based on Plato's Republic Symposium, in which they were trying to replicate a kind of a Platonic world with living without a body for the audience members. these are just a few examples of techno-objects that have application in transmedia. And we're going to move on to the thought, the third component, the third internal variable. And this is a kind of a tricky one because in classical dramaturgy, the thought is that philosophical point that the work is trying to make. But in transmedia, it's much more difficult to control and to figure out because there is no you don't necessarily have control over the ending of your work. And this is Peter Lee from the No Long company talks about it, that there is the ending in theater is always determined, unlike a game in which the ending is sort of always open-ended. So when we think about the idea of a thought, the Aristotelian definition is that I'm sorry, let's click my. And the Aristotelian definition is that it's some sort of philosophical saying that is pertinent, and that it's a maxim, a statement that reveals some truth of human existence. Lawyers agree, called it premise, a proposition that's supposed to prove something, an argument on philosophical thought. This is, at the origins of the relationship between theater and philosophy, yeah? That theater attempts to show what philosophy is arguing about, and to reveal some kind of truth of human existence, either universal for the moment or in general. So in drama, the thoughts that we often ponder and discuss have to do with the human existence. Why do we exist? What's the good life? Why do we suffer? What is love? What is worth living for? What is worth dying for? So thoughts make you question your moral universe, and your understanding of reality teaches you something about yourself and others. In game, that's little simple, like who wins, yeah. And this very early application of video games to theater, where sort of theater games, urban theater games that had objective was to win something or to achieve something. But most recently, we actually experienced a reversal, and theater is influencing video game world, and the video games are becoming more philosophical and more more in line with what theater used to be by asking the same questions that theater used to ask. It is still asking. So in transmedia performance, we basically have sort of emerged three different types of thoughts. There is the ethical questions, which create a world with moral issues and choices through multi-platform participatory performance. Then there is the social political, which goes beyond simple game to represent some sort of political or social reality, replicates and makes visible the pre-existing power structures and systems. And then emotional, which mimics some sort of experience of the other, so different types of disability simulations or simulations of other marginalized experiences. And those are kind of the three major purposes that emerged in research transmedia. So this is a work adaptation of Faustus, a game in which the audience members were asked to were sort of asked to ponder, think about what would they give up to get what they want, or who would they sell would they to get what they want. So it was a kind of an interesting work because it was an adaptation of Faustus, but every audience member was individually asked to make the same ethical decisions that the Faustus was forced to make. And it was across multiple cities, both in real life and through app, people participated. Those type of moral games, moral theater games, are actually quite prominent and quite popular. I find this one the most interesting simply because it's based on on Faust. So. And this one was also interesting. This was an adaptation of Trial, and it was done in Spain by the Stroke 114 company, and it involved both real life experiences and social media, phone conversations. And the idea was to help audience members understand the nature of totalitarianism by creating this type of experiences of totalitarian process in action. And it was both real life and social media, as I mentioned. So the purpose of it was, political, social awareness, and making a point about the nature of totalitarian state. Then there is a whole, branch of transmedia which attempt to replicate some form of disability. This is Leerbach, The Blind, in which the audience members were blinded and, attempted to kind of have this multisensory installation which promised to change the boundaries between audience and performer. The other project that was in the same vein was a VR project out of Germany, which attempted to simulate the intellectual disability. There is quite a lot of controversy about these projects, because what we found out is that they actually make people more antagonistic toward the disabled. And so instead of building empathy, they actually create more alienation, simply because, when you're disabled, you have experience with your disability for your entire life, so it's natural to you. But if somebody is thrown into that disability suddenly without experiencing this before, it can be a very alienating experience. So instead of creating empathy and creating connection, those experiences actually can be quite alienating. And of course, there's sort of different types of experiences that's supposed to replicate marginalized experiences, like immigrants crossing the border in a truck and things like that. And there's a lot of ethical questions around this, because like, can you commodify that kind of experience, and can you like what does it mean to experience something, and the knowledge that comes from that experience, can you commodify that knowledge and actually transpose it to someone else? Now, after all of this, looking at the internal and external variable, I want to do a quick sort of overview of where we are after the pandemic, when theaters closed and we were all kind of stuck at home, and theater people and all of these marginal experiences before pandemic, suddenly everybody was trying to do theater using digital tools that we had, and experimenting with different forms of transmedia, postcard theater, Zoom theater, Facebook theater, all sorts of different things. So, so what's going on with the Zoom dramaturgy? So the Zoom dramaturgy is multi-site, but not site-specific, because there is no pre-existing audience members when you're performing from home, maybe, except your cat or something. Then there is synced but open-ended. You can watch it later. Synced but doesn't really feel like it. It's closed, but it feels open-ended. It's grounded in the face and voice. It's bodiless and immobile. And the different styles that emerged is the realistic, non-Zoom specific. So the play that is performed on Zoom can happen outside of Zoom. Zoom specific, it can only happen on Zoom. Immersive, Zoom talks to you and you talk to the Zoom. Integrated, part of transmedia architectonics, incorporating other platforms. Adaptive, adaptations of pre-existing texts. And then there is the meta type of Zoom theater, which grapples with the limits of form, commenting on the limits of its content. And finally, we have the post-dramatic Zoomaturgy. And I want to just very quickly show you some examples of those. So here was a really fun play about the family interaction on Zoom.
So the bartender says,
let me see.
What's funny?
You know what we should have done if we could have? Actually, maybe the Beekman could still do this.
What?
There's an inn up in Lakeville, and they closed the inn, but they also have a restaurant so that, they could keep doing takeout. And the restaurant put on its website that for every order, we'll give away a free roll of toilet paper.
Well, were they hoarding?
No, they're an inn, Barbara, with no guests, so they have toilet paper. He told me this.
Yeah, so within 3 hours, they had 600 takeout orders. We had only had...
So it's written for Zoom, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen on Zoom. It could be a family conversation around the table. The other types of Zoom theater that emerged is things written for Zoom that can happen only on Zoom. And this was a cool play by Adam Brace with Diana Quick, with the mother trying to communicate with her daughter, who is, in different place, and the mother accidentally records all of her Zoom monologues.
After we'd left the thing itself, and was on very boisterous form, giving it both barrels to the poor driver with the some of his prehistoric jokes. I used to think your father felt a kinship with taxi drivers, but it's more he can't resist a captive audience. He bought me this at a garage to sober me up, a power aid.
So it's a one-person performance, but the Zoom is essential to tell the story because it creates intimacy, and she would not really record those messages unless she had, Zoom to do it on.
Hello, this is Michael.
This is a fun interactive Zoom tarot reading where people can, log in and have a scripted conversation with the reader. This was a performance that happened in the spring, which incorporated both Zoom and Facebook pre-recorded and live components. Pre-recorded were posted on Facebook, and then live components happened on Zoom and Facebook, and the pre-recorded were posted on YouTube. So there is, incorporates, in addition to Zoom, there were other components that it also incorporates. Here, the adaptations of different texts. This is a Chinese adaptation of Waiting for Godot. And of course, Chekhov, very popular, Decameron as well. People are trying to adapt different pre-existing theatrical texts to Zoom. Here, it was a very interesting, what Lola Proaño Gomez calls dramaturgy of confinement, where the form tries to comment on itself and also capture the feeling of confinement that Zoom and pandemic provided, and to illustrate through the form the psychological situation of its audience, of its participants. And here, my favorite one is a Carol Churchill adaptation of Mad Forest, which at moments makes no sense, but it's wonderful to watch because it incorporates all of these different ways of storytelling, post-dramatic storytelling, in which the story is being told through abstraction. So there is no obvious connection between different components.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ashley Tata. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webcast of Mad Forest. We will begin a few minutes after 7 in order to give anyone who participates in it the opportunity to go and thank the frontline workers.
So the way that the show itself was, it was told by
the dog is hungry
in the same mode with different scenes and different disconnected imagery with the different audience members participating. So different cast members participating as well. So so this was Mad Forest, and so the Zoom dramaturgy. We see it as it develops, as people grapple with the new medium and new existential condition, many unanswered questions and many new yet unexplored directions. It's inclusive and it's probably here to stay. And so The big question that we ask on Transmedia Dramaturgy is how can it help shape the framework and vocabulary for human-machine AI interaction in 3D, transmedial, and digital narrative spaces? What do you want to say, do, and why versus what are you saying, doing, and why? How is what you saying and watching contributing to the transmedia narratives you participate in? And finally, Transmedia Dramaturgy can help us uncover how knowledge and emotions are created and shaped between the virtual and real spaces, from conspiracy theories and political campaigns to multiplayer immersive games and multi-platform narratives. Finally, the last issue is the transmedia ethics. So when you mix reality and fiction, you may end up with 2 million, fee from Boston firefighting units attempting to disbomb your fake, Moonites. This happened in 2007 in Boston. Fake news that are supposed to be part of the narrative that suddenly become part of the discourse, of the public discourse. Trouble with immersion and the limits of consent. How can you give your audience PTSD? In sociological experiments, you need to follow human subject research regulations, but in theater experiments you don't. And so this is kind of a question, particularly when you're managing emotions and a lot of internal knowledge of the participants. And then algorithm bias, if you're using algorithm, educational, social, political, artistic endeavors with some mind-changing objectives, how biased those algorithms will be. And of course, violence and sex by proxy, do they prevent or normalize criminalized desires? So these are sort of the ethical questions that we are asking of transmedia right now, as we both are looking at it, making it and analyzing it. And if you are interested in keeping track of the latest transmedia works, I invite you to visit our section on transmedia at the Theater Times, and of course to hear our coming future lectures on transmedia at Mahindra, and also visit MetaLab and see what projects and lectures we are there as well. So thank you, everyone, and we can ask questions. I try to keep it within the time frame, but there is a lot of material to cover. So I hope this was informative and help us open up the conversation about how to create and think and talk about transmedia.
It was informative, Magda. Thank you very much for such a detailed lecture introducing a variety of transmedia performances.